Katherine and Lewis.
Hi, thanks very much, Claire, and welcome to everyone. And those of you who were here for the first webinar as well, thanks for coming back again. I'm very fortunate to have Lewis here with me today, and he's going to share some tips about how they do things remotely at DisplayLink. And just a bit of a recap for those of you who weren't on the first webinar. Claire and I were talking about how to support Cambridge Network members who are recruiting during lockdown, and particularly those of us who perhaps aren't as familiar with interviewing remotely and via video. And it was such a big topic that we decided to do it in 3 webinars. Now, the first webinar, which you can, I think, Claire, we can still get that, can't we, on the Cambridge Network website. We covered about mindset. How do we as human beings cope with sensory deprivation? And one of the areas that we really looked at closely was listening very deeply and being aware of our unconscious bias. So some of that we'll be going back into. However, for today, it's going to be very much focused on the actual interview. And something that struck me as I've been doing more interviews online in the last few weeks is that when we have a silence when we're with people, we know if it's a natural silence or not. But when we have a silence in an interview online, we immediately think is a technical hitch. And all of our biases will come to play, and we'll either judge that person for not having good technology or panic and think there's a problem. So just to be aware of all of these things that might be going on. Now, in my work that I do with scaling businesses, I work with founders and line managers who are recruiting to coach them to think about recruitment differently and be aware of behaviors and what's going on for candidates. But another of the roles that I have is sitting as an independent member for the Judicial Appointments Commission. And Monday was a little bit of a baptism on fire, because for the first time ever, we had to sit as a panel interviewing for a very senior judicial role. And we had lots of things that were unexpected. Firstly, we were all set up to use Zoom until Thursday last week. And then an official memo went out saying it's not secure enough. We all had to change to Microsoft Teams. So fortunately, I'm just a user. I was sent a link, but behind the scenes, there was an awful lot going on. The judge who was meant to be sitting in on those interviews alongside us came onto a call and said, the country is in crisis. We're working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. I just haven't got the time. So he had to hand over to another appeal court judge. Now, Sunday afternoon, we were having a prep conversation with that judge. Now, if it hadn't been for the amazing preparation for those interviews that goes on 6 months before those interviews actually happen, that seamless handover would not have been able to happen. And the tip that I could give you that'll carry you throughout is preparation, preparation, preparation. Now, I'm not going to talk tech, as I said. Instead, I'm going to talk about bread. Now, I wondered if you, one of the thousands, there must be thousands of people in the UK who are baking their own bread, because every time I go to my local supermarket, those bread shelves are absolutely empty. Now, it's not me who's baking bread. It's my husband. He has taken to being the sourdough king of our street. And the airing cupboard is just outside my office. And every few hours I hear open, close, open, close. And he's got his starter, which is a form of his own yeast that he's creating. And it takes 7 days of nursing this bottle of starter before he can bake this bread. Now, the bread you see is one of the best of the bunch, but there have been quite a few flops along the way. How many of us think that our interview techniques are at times half-baked and below par? A good interview and good recruitment means planning, setup, and care. It's not that random, quickly print off a CV and fire questions at people. In fact, interviewing is really simple if you think about it. There are just three things that we want to know. Can they do the job, or could they do the job? Do they want to do the job? And will they fit in? Now, Sarah is going to launch a poll, and I'd like you to rate which of these, or weight, which of these do you think is the most important of the three? Can they do the job? Do they want to do the job, or will they fit in? Do we have any scores coming in, Sarah?
Yeah, we've got loads of responses. Thanks everyone for voting. It's looking quite even at the moment. I'm just waiting for a few more people in case there's anyone else left to vote. It's looking very even. So I think we'll end there. That's, oh, right, we've got one more. Just one more person left to vote. Okay, so I'm sharing the results with you all now. As you can see, it's pretty even, but number one, 40% is can they do the job has come out on top.
Yes.
This is followed by do they want the job, and then 26% will they fit in.
Gosh, thank you very much, everyone, for voting. That's brilliant. If we think about those three critical elements that we require when hiring, Lewis, what's important for you? I think you're on mute at the moment, Lewis.
I keep muting and unmuting deliberately, save you from my coughs. So I actually have quite a strong opinion on this one, and for display link, it is always absolutely do they want to do the job, and motivation is really so important here. There's no point in interviewing or getting your hiring manager to interview, any of the other interviewers to interview, if they're not going to want to do the job. It really is a waste of time. Doesn't matter if they can do the job. I had a candidate earlier this week who I just knew he could do the job, but he didn't join us because he wasn't that interested, and it was a waste of time. So we always find it's most important to find out motivation first, and we'll talk about that later actually in one of the other slides. But just to give you a very simple example, we hired a receptionist recently, and I'm sure most of you know that reception is actually quite a complex role. It's not just reception. You'll be doing admin, purchasing, all sorts of things you end up doing as a receptionist. It's not just about having brilliant receptionist skills, which obviously are key. And we met someone who was probably lacking in their Excel skills, their purchasing experience, and so on. But her motivation, her desire to do the job and to learn and to grow was just outstanding. It was clear to see. So our hiring managers, in fact there was two hiring managers, they understood that actually it was better to take her on and have an exceptional receptionist who we could coach and train, and she would grow into the job because she had the passion. And she worked out fantastic. And in fact, I now have to backfilled her because she's now working in finance, doing purchasing admin. She was a fantastic hire. So that was a way better outcome. So
that's a
for
great
me, passion
story.
first, motivation first, always.
Passion and motivation. Well, for me, I find most people, if you just look at the way job descriptions are written, focus 80% of the time on can they do the job, because that's the experience, qualifications, skills lists that you see. And for me, it's like having a three-legged stool. all of those are equally important. You can't have one without the other. And if we use that bread analogy, if we leave out the yeast, the bread will flop. It's exactly the same when recruiting. All three of those elements are really important. Thank you for voting. And actually, it was a little bit of a trick question, but good to see that most of you are quite close on that. If we move to that first critical element or leg of the stool, and that is, can they do the job? And it actually starts with us and taking that step back and thinking about, what is it that we're really looking for? And what's the context into which we're hiring? One of the very high visibility issues that we've all seen in recent weeks has been Boris Johnson rushed into hospital in intensive care. Fortunately, they already have thought about succession planning. Dominic Raab took over from him, and in government, it's all set up and they've got that plan. However, there are lots of CEOs and business owners who've been thinking, what is it that, who is going to backfill me? So maybe that's the context into which you're hiring. You want more junior people to backfill more senior people. Or, as I find a lot, especially in Cambridge, is people, we want to change the shape of our businesses and increase diversity. Now, diversity is a topic all on its own, but it's another context into which we're hiring. Lewis, how do you deal with this at DisplayLink?
So it's really going back to the basics. I find that you really have to understand the position, but to understand the position, you have to understand your own business, and often you have to understand your client's businesses too, because you need to know, what that person will be doing, what their impact is going to be, their responsibilities, and the candidate will want to know this. And this is a very important factor for them: is what impact will I have? You can't tell them that unless you actually understand it. And the roles are so different. We've got some very niche pre-silicon firmware engineers. That's totally different from a product manager. So I'll be having totally different conversations with those. The interviews will be totally different. And you're looking at different aspects which will be important to the candidate. Their personal characteristics are going to be very different. So, unless you understand those roles, you won't know what to look for in those candidates and what questions to ask. So it's going back to what Katherine was saying, really, is be prepared. Unless you really understand it all, you're not going to be prepared, because you won't know what questions to ask, and you won't be able to feed it back to the candidate.
Thank you. And Lewis, sometimes, I don't know if you do this with your line managers. However, when I'm working with my clients and coaching them, I often get them to really almost put themselves in the shoes of this person that they're going to be hiring and think, what activities are they going to be doing every day? Who are they engaging with internally, externally? Where are they spending their time?
Yeah, I this is actually going back to when I started in recruitment agency work. I couldn't recruit a role unless I could picture what these people were doing and the environment in my mind. I needed to be there, needed to see it. And it is the same as interviewing a candidate. You interview the hiring manager. What are their activities? What's the measurement of success? How will you know whether they're doing, they're going to be successful after 3 months? How they're going to pass their probation? The hiring manager should be able to answer all of those. If they can't, then it's half-baked, to steal your words.
Great. So to help us decide how can they do the job, it's always good to get them to do something quite practical. And this can be a challenge to do remotely. Some things anyway, we've got online tests for, so that's not a problem. However, they do require a tweak and some extra time. When you and I were talking, Lewis, you said that you've had some recent examples of this.
Oh, yes. Yeah, so as Katherine said, that there's a lot of existing stuff just works. We do have a remote coding test that we haven't had to change at all because it was already remote. However, when we have a face-to-face, it's now virtual face-to-face. We want to keep the format as same as we can, really, because it's proven it works. And when we're talking about software engineers, we whiteboard on the wall, we go through problems together on a whiteboard, and so on. Now, obviously very difficult if you're physically not in the room. However, there is a thing called webwhiteboard.com, and that's a virtual whiteboard. It's free. There is a purchase version, of course, but it absolutely works fine. So our engineers had a play with that. They practice interviewing on each other with it. And then once they were happy with that, they just handed that to me to put into the invites of the candidate. So we've transitioned from a physical whiteboard to a virtual one, and it's been working perfectly. In fact, we've ended up with 2 offers in the last 2 weeks by using this.
Gosh, that's really good. And an example that I can give you of something that translated, and we weren't quite sure how it would work, is on Monday when we were sitting as a panel and interviewing, we had, typically if we were in a face-to-face situation, the candidate would have arrived 45 minutes before the interview, been given a scenario to work through for 30 minutes, and then come into the interview. We now had to do this all on Microsoft Teams. What we did instead was the candidate went into their virtual room, but was watched by an assessor to make sure they weren't Googling the answers. They then, after 30 minutes, came into our interview room. The judge asked the scenario questions, and then all 3 of us scored individually. And it actually worked really well. So sometimes you just need to tweak what you would have done, or as Lewis, you were saying, to have an online tool. Are there any other examples, Lewis, that you've got of recently helping candidates get the hang of things?
Yes, I was going to say one of the really key things is to test with the candidate if necessary. So we had a very senior exec level appointment recently, and the candidates had to do a 20-minute presentation to the execs via life size, so similar to Zoom. And it's a scary time for them anyway to do a 20-minute presentation to the execs, but you really wouldn't want to be finding out in front of the execs whether it's going to work or not. So I volunteered to the candidates to be their guinea pigs. So it's not an interview, it's just try it out on Lewis and see if it all works. And I'm so glad we did, because 2 of the candidates that took me up on that both needed to adjust their equipment. One ended up using a phone and a PC, I think. One used a tablet and a PC because their personal equipment just wasn't really up to it as it stood. I also had to give them feedback saying, right, just be aware there's a 2-second delay between your voice and the video. You need to counter that. You need to be aware of that. And afterwards it was fine, and it clearly worked because one of them is joining us beginning of next month. And also, I think he'll like me because I helped him. So it's a brilliant way of building a relationship with a candidate through the process. I jest, but actually it helps build a really good connection with that candidate. And in fact, the one that's joining was my favored candidate from that interaction with him. So test.
Great.
Great. Can I just come in there as well, guys?
Certainly.
Just quickly, there's a few questions on the chat that have come through. And just asking if there's anything that you know of or can recommend for admin testing. I know we've spoken about kind of the web whiteboard, but do you know of anything in the admin world, commercial world, that would help to assess candidates? Or are we looking at the kind of online psychometric testing type things?
Well, you've got psychometrics, I think, would be different. I think you've got your reasoning skills and you've got numerical skill tests that you can do. I haven't personally got any experience of that. Lewis, is there anything you might have done?
So I think you could replicate probably your existing things. So we haven't had to do it recently. We don't hire very many admin at all. However, when we have, we usually sit a candidate down with, say, an Excel a laptop with an Excel and get them to, I don't know, copy, do a formula or something like this. And if it's a receptionist role, we might get them to write an email to see how tactful they are about people doing naughty things in the company. And a lot of that you could replicate. And even if you can't give them your own laptop to work on, by using screen share or the whiteboard or something like that, you could effectively be sitting beside them, provided they had their own equipment to do it on. So you might be able to use your existing tests using a whiteboard program or a simple screen share. But again, you might need to test it with the candidates if they can actually do it. So basically what you want to be doing is sitting beside them like you would normally, and you might be able to do that with screen share, because I haven't had to do any admin ones since the lockdown, so
Okay.
I haven't actually looked into that.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Some suggestions just on a couple of platforms. One, My Interview. Apparently that's a good platform. So we'll put these together at the end and share some of the links so that people can have a look at those as well.
Thank you. Because I mean, that was going to be my question. So thank you, those of you who asked, is, what practical tests have you had success with when recruiting remotely? So if there are any others that you'd be happy to share, that would be absolutely wonderful. Okay. Because the trouble is, it's keeping on top of them all. They're just like I didn't know there were so many video platforms until I spoke to Lewis. I mean, I'd never heard of Life Size, so it just shows.
Excellent. We've got a few others coming through. So Excel on screen share on Zoom, allowing candidates to edit those. So I think anything like that, like you say, Lewis, it's adapting our current the current tools we have available to us to the type of work or the type of candidate. So yeah, we'll put some of those together and send them round at the end. So great, thanks for sharing.
You could probably use Google Docs as well, by the way, because you both have access to that.
Yes.
Perfect.
Right. So now we've got them to do something. The next section really that we're going to cover is about asking insightful questions. And as I mentioned earlier, is yes, we need to do a lot of deep listening when we are having an interview, but especially when we're doing it remotely. But listening is not a one-way street. By pre-planning and asking objectively how the questions, we can then find evidence for whether they can do the job or not. And in fact, one shrewd question can reveal an awful lot about how someone's likely to operate in your environment or not. I'm going to hand you over to Lewis to take us through some things that he does around questioning.
So going back to some of the things we said earlier, you really need to design the interview or interviews for each type of position, and one size does not fit all. So I'll be asking some very different questions for an IC designer than I would for a software practice manager, for instance. And for this, I will have a list of questions that I might dip into. For software practice manager, it might be competency-based questions, such as, what sort of problems have your staff brought you recently? How did you assist them? We may have different technical tests. We might do a case study, group exercise. It really depends on the role. So you need to plan. And you need to use a number of techniques. So we use funneling. You might wonder what that is. It's a bit like a sales funnel. You have a number of top level questions, subjects that you're interested in, and then you want to delve into that subject deeper and deeper and deeper until you get the sort of the nugget of information at the bottom. So for an example, have you introduced Agile into a company? How was it received? How did you get this particular person on board? How did you scale it? You just keep asking more detailed questions on that subject until you get the answer that, the good or bad, that you're interested in. Then you go to the top again and ask the next subject that you're interested in. And interviewing, the basics of interviewing is asking open and closed questions, and closed for control and open to get them to talk. And you know, what do you know? What is your feeling on? Describe, is this true? Is a, in a closed one, you use closed to control the interview because you are in charge of it. You ask open question, you're handing control to the other person. But, you know, if you learn anything, learn how to do open and closed questions. Now, when I do telephone interviews and face-to-face, but mainly telephone, I ask many related questions that are the same sort of, they're after the same sort of information. I'm trying to extract the same sort of answers, really. And I'll explain more about this in 2 or 3 slides time. I don't want to give any spoilers on that. Our engineers tend to use something called 5 whys. And this is where you ask the same question differently, or even the same, five times in a row. And it's very similar to funneling, you just dig deeper. But I always have a template of questions. You know, these are reminders, and I'd never ask all of them. I certainly never ask them how they're written, but they're a reminder to me. So I've always got that in front of me so I can dip into it. So that's really the basics of how I do it.
That's really useful. I think having that bank of questions to come back to is something that I found really helpful in the interviews I do as well. But I wondered if any of you would like to share your favorite killer question that you ask in an interview.
I think we might have a few people thinking about it.
Yes.
No one's had any through yet, but give them a moment.
I love sharing questions because you don't always think of,
no.
You think, gosh, that's brilliant.
Gwen Stacey, I just was thinking that the killer question may often, it depends on the drivers of the individual being interviewed. And for some people, the salary is just the bottom line, and if they realise there's no movement on the salary, they're out of the equation, if from their perspective. And also advancement quite often is potentially a killer question if someone's in a point at which they're trying to move up and typically people are using a new job as a way of moving up, obviously. Some people that may not be the case though. So I think the killer question depends on the actual individual that you're interviewing, although there may be generic ones, and I'd be pleased to hear if anybody has one.
Yeah, we've had quite a few come through now, so really interesting. So yeah, why should we give you this job? So quite a direct one there. What do you know about us? How do you deal with failure when things don't go to plan? I think that's a really good open question, and yeah, perhaps ask for scenarios to describe a situation that's happened. What's the most important thing you've learned in your current role in the past year? I really like this one as well. If we spoke to your current colleagues, what would they tell me about you? That one's very telling. You'd have to be quite brave to.
I have used that a lot, actually.
Deeply into that one. I like that one. And at the end, what did you hope we would ask you but haven't asked you? I really like that one as well. That's fantastic. So, and why do you want to work for us? So,
I like that last one. You know, anything you would have asked, which was quite clever. I noticed when we asked that on Monday in our interviews with the judges, 2 of them slipped in some really useful things that we hadn't asked, but they knew was critical to the job role and swayed our opinion. So, wonderful. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for those questions. I'll definitely be using some of them. When we're interviewing anyway, we probably, most of us, thinking about, is this person confident or competent? And in fact, what is the difference between confidence and competence? I find when you're not sitting with somebody, this becomes a lot more difficult to figure out because we can't necessarily always hear the tone because we may not have the best Wi-Fi connection. And you haven't got all those other senses that we're picking up. Are they just blustering or are they genuinely confident? And it's a real potential, what I call a derailer in a video interview. And there are 2 faces to confidence. we've got external confidence, where we might be seen to be extrovert and charismatic. But you can also be very internally confident, but not necessarily project that to other people. Most cultures, and this is, probably 80% around the world, equate confidence with competence. And yet I'm sure we all have stories of people who've got to the top who certainly aren't competent and shouldn't be doing that job. Those overconfident people who hiding their insecurities are the ones that we need to really ask those questions that Lewis was talking about really carefully. And there's an underrated characteristic that I think for me is a very attractive quality in a candidate, and that is modesty. If somebody actually puts their hands up and admits they don't know something or they could work on it, that's showing a huge amount of internal confidence and taking a bit of a risk in an interview. The third judge we interviewed on Monday did exactly that, because in their role, they're going to have to be good at dealing with politics. The first two candidates, when we asked them the question, how would you deal with the political aspects of this job, blustered a bit and obviously thought about it. But he just sat back and said, it's not something that I've had to deal with much so far in my career. And what I do with it about this is I would firstly be really well prepared for when I've got to stand up in front of all of these committees. And secondly, I would just deal with it and as it comes. But I know who I could ask, who I regard as politically astute, for some tips. And that gave that all those personal qualities and that internal confidence that he showed there was really, why we thought he was a strong candidate. So don't be distracted by overconfidence. Instead, just be cautious. We now move to the next element that you all voted for in the poll as being second on the list. However, for Lewis, as we know, motive really matters, because motivation to do the job, yes, they need to be paid a certain amount. It's got to be in the right geographical area, all of those things. But for most of us, we can be consciously aware of some things that are important to us in our work. But a lot of the time, this is running at an unconscious level. And I think Claire was mentioning earlier about having psychometric tests. That's quite useful, another form of testing that you could do before the interview. I personally use a psycholinguistic tool called the Language and Behavioral Profile, or the LAB profile, because what this does is we're listening to people's language patterns. So in the interview, if they're using certain words, I will know what that motivation is, and then I can zoom in right there and then and funnel them down and ask them more about it. But for those of you who aren't trained on this, one really useful question that you could ask, and I ask it when I'm doing having career development conversations or in an interview, and that is, what is important to you in your work? Now, it sounds simple, but the words that they give you are really important, because they might say, a lot of people say, I want to be able to make a difference. I'd like to work with really nice people, or I want autonomy. I write down word for word what they're saying. And when we come to later on in the process and making them the offer, we can actually use their exact words. And in fact, in the next webinar, I'll be building on this about onboarding. You know what that core underlying motivation is, and that motive really matters. But Lewis, how do you test for motive?
So a lot of what I'm going to say is actually going to be on the next slide, but thank you very much. So what I do in the interviews, as I mentioned earlier, is I ask a lot of related questions. Now, I'm going to give you some examples specific to this. And, you know, those who are old enough to know Blade Runner will know about the void comp test, where you, Decker is asking a load of questions to find out whether there's sense. Well, I'm not trying to do that, but I am trying to do the same thing of asking a lot of related questions which are cross-referenced to get the real picture and to understand if this is the person who's actually interested in what we want to do. So I will, for example, ask, you know, why are you looking for a job? What are you looking for? What are you not getting in your current job at the moment? When have you been most happy or most satisfied, which is often at the same time at work? What has made you unhappy or unsatisfied? What are the top 3 things you're going to think about when considering a job offer? And by job offer, I mean location, money, team fit, growth, you know, everything that makes up a new life in a new company. What other roles are you interviewing for? Now, if you think of all those things I've asked there, they're not the same question, but they're going to have, well, you'd expect a consistency. You'd expect to get, you know, a full picture of their desires, you know, the real picture of what it is that they want and why. If it's not consistent, you will sense that very quickly, and you know that you have to ask more questions to understand. So if they've told you at the beginning, you know, I am absolutely wanting to be a Scrum Master, and then you discover that the other interviewers are program managers, it doesn't add up. The other advantage of doing this is that at the other end of the process, hopefully when you're going to be offering them, I'm trying to think of a way of putting this so it doesn't sound bad. You know what buttons to press. You know how to sell to them. And it also means that you can be, you know when to be honest with them about what you can't offer them, and what part of their desires you really can't help with. And you know this is key, because you don't want attrition. You want people to be happy. You want the right people to join. So you need to be honest with them at all times. Now, we look for people, as you probably picked up by now, with real passion to the job. You know, we don't like arrogance. We won't tolerate it, to be honest. We desire people who have the desire to collaborate and listen, mentor others, be mentored, grow. So by asking these questions, you should be able to judge whether they are the right type of person for your company and for that role. It takes practice. This is not rocket science. This is just something I've collected over the last 20 years in recruitment. But again, I write them down, and I've got them there to dip into, and I might use them all. In fact, most of those I think I do. And you practice, practice, practice. I hope that answers your question, Catherine.
It does. Thanks so much, Lewis. And I think something that when I've spoken to you about what is a display link person like, you always come back to that, having a real passion for what they do. So that's really good to hear.
And I think you as an interviewer have to be passionate about what you do and your company. You've got to be real.
Yes. Now, we're going to move to the next section. And in fact, in some ways, Lewis, you know, what you've been talking about in terms of that ethos of display link people being passionate. But how do we know that that person that we've only interviewing remotely, we've never met, is going to fit in to your company and your culture? And this is the most challenging thing to assess. They're on their best behavior, as we all are in an interview, but we're not seeing them warts and all. It also, as I mentioned earlier, if there's a technical hitch or they're distracted and they've got kids in the background or dogs barking or something, we will form an immediate impression about them and our biases might just kick in. And I found the other side of that is we become more reluctant to make a decision about who's going to fit in because we're just not sure. So Lewis, how do you get over this hurdle?
Again, it's very much about putting them at ease, having the right sort of questions, being honest and see how they respond. And if you, I mean, in a face-to-face interview, I'd be watching body language, to be honest. And if I see they're becoming uncomfortable or not picking up signals, I would stop the interview and think, what did I say? And go back and ask again. You know, when I ask this question, you seem uncomfortable. You know, how do you feel about this? And it really is like trying to do active listening. Well, it is active listening, I suppose, but being much more aware. On the next slide, you know, we'll talk about some more of this, really, where you can sort of do more to sanity check. But it really is watching, listening, going back and checking if you see any hints of body language saying that they're not comfortable. But you have to try harder on video.
Yes, you do. And Lewis, I'm thinking about assessing their attitude. You know, the impact for, I suppose, you getting it right is one thing, but for the candidate, it's massive, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. So one of the things that DisplayLink always does is offer candidates the opportunity to interview us through the process, but also after we've offered them a job. You know, they now, before the lockdown, they were always welcome. In fact, in pre-interview, we used to have coffees with some of them. So not in, I suppose the interview is an interview really, but you know, they could have an informal chat with some of the team. But we always offer them the possibility of coming in, okay, virtually now, to chat to the team, to understand the role, the dynamics, the characteristics of the other teams. And you know, that will give us more confirmation that they'll fit into the team, but it also allows them to have all the information to make an educated decision on, is this the right job for them? Is this the right company for them? Is this the right culture for them? So if we get it wrong, it's an irritation. You know, we might remember the name in a year's time. I jest, we probably will, but you know, we're business, we'll survive, we'll move on. For the candidate, this is their career, this is their livelihood. You know, it's a massive impact on them. You know, it's totally disproportionate. So we try very, very hard to get it right on the very first call. But you know, we're not perfect. It can go wrong. In fact, I think we've only had 2 candidates in 3 years who've come back in and gone away and say, actually, I don't want the job. At the end of the day, didn't want the job in the first place. That they got through. We did have one candidate that I really loved on the phone. I think it was fantastic until at face-to-face he swore twice in 2 different interviews, and swearing in an interview is so inappropriate, and if they do that in front of the customers, you can imagine that's going to go down. So you know, this is not an exact science, I'm afraid.
No, that's amazing.
Sorry, just thinking about virtually showing people your working environment as well. I mean, obviously they can look up DisplayLink and have a look at what your products are, etc. Have you made, I don't know whether any other companies done this, just a thought that popped into my head, whether you've made a virtual tour of the office or...
Yes, so actually I'm going to answer one of the questions on the chat in this answer to Claire. So we, as part of a graduate recruitment, got a virtual tour and you know, a video of the buildings and staff and interviews. We're going to, with this wonderful new building we have that we're no longer in, which is very frustrating. You know, we are debating doing a 360 tour, and that would be very nice, or just another virtual tour of the different teams and so on, so people could get a feeling of that. So I think it's especially for candidate attraction, it's a really important thing. So one of the questions was about company values. Now, funny enough, we're actually in the middle of trying to articulate that. We've done a big study. We've got another company in to interview everybody that they could find that would talk to them. And they are putting together a big report to enable us to articulate our company values properly to each other and to candidates, because you will find company values vary from team to team and from country to country. So it is non-trivial. Now, I have my view on the company values, and this is the one that obviously I relate to candidates, which is all about collaboration, passion, trust, listening to others' points of view. Even if you're the tech lead and you think that you're the right, you have the right solution, you need to be able to listen to others and take their point of view, and you might back down or you might win because you were right. That's my take on it, which is shared, I believe, by most of them, seeing as I've helped grow it from 36 to 300.
Gosh, thank you. That's really interesting, Lewis, because a candidate might very well ask, if they were astute, how do you live your values?
Yes.
So once you've got a set of values, it's important to be able to prove them. Coming back to working style, excuse me, I think that this is tricky because we're all working remotely, and some of us love it and some of us hate it. So how do we know whether a candidate is going to fit in post-lockdown into our normal environment? So psychometric tests, or again, I refer back to the language behavioral profile, we can ask questions to ascertain if they like to be independent, which is have sole responsibilities and not be distracted. So that's home working. Or if they like to work in a cooperative environment, which is most offices, open plan, sitting next to one another, sharing information. But the majority of people actually like a little bit of both, which is having a distinct territory of responsibility and then working alongside others. And I was thinking that if you could ascertain how they like to work and then manage their expectations very closely and say, this isn't normal, we would only really allow you to work from home after 3 months of being with us, and maybe 1 day a week on a special project or whatever it is. Otherwise, there could be a real mismatch. Coming back to this challenge of interviewing remotely, there are these 4 things that I would stress. If you could be really intentional about and conscious about, and that is to be objective, being open, and being open, I mean being tolerant of all the glitches and all of the adaptations that people are having to make to be interviewed and to interview. Being curious will counter some of that as well. Asking those questions that Lewis has been talking about. And then being present. Now, when I mean being present is going back to Monday's interviews, we had quite short breaks in between each interview. But what I found, and I'm sure some of you are finding as well, is being on video constantly can be absolutely exhausting. In fact, Sarah Stones, who's on this webinar, shared a very interesting article with me where they've done some research. And why it's so exhausting is because when you're on a video call, you can actually see yourself. And that's not what we're used to doing as human beings. So we're always in presentation mode, which can be really exhausting. So as soon as your interview is finished, switch off the camera, switch off your sound, regroup, take time, allow setup and any glitches before your next interview so that you can be present in your next interview. For those candidates, it's so important. This could be the biggest decision that they made. The ones on Monday, the judicial role we were recruiting for, they've been waiting 14 years for somebody to retire, for that role to become available. So we need to give them every opportunity to have our full attention. A bonus tip from all of this preparation and pre-planning that I'd like to share with you, that I find increasingly over all the years that I've interviewed and the coaching that I've done, and that is to have some kind of predefined scoring system. Now, it could be pretty simple. The one that I've used most recently is simply an A to a D. A is outstanding, B is strong, C sufficient, and D is insufficient. And you will know by looking at the skills you're looking for. So let's say you're looking for leadership, personal qualities. You will know what outstanding looks like, what strong looks like. So you've predefined it. So if you've got a co-pilot or a co-interviewer, or you're on a panel, if you can all make notes, score individually, it makes a massive difference. Practically what I did on Monday, I'm fortunate I've got quite a big screen in front of me. With Microsoft Teams, I had one interviewer above the other of my panel, and then the candidate came up on the panel below, and I had a space at the top. So I dragged my Word document with my place where I could make notes. And because I was looking towards them, they thought I was maintaining eye contact. So I could type my notes against all of the criteria. When we'd finished the interview, we then, as I said earlier, we switched off our screens, we took 10 minutes. I could score completely independently without being influenced by my panel. We then went back together and we could compare notes and come to a decision. But the best of all is we can then give all of those candidates feedback, because we've all got concrete evidence of what they said against the questions. So that for me has been really helpful with interviewing via video.
Great, thank you. Katherine, just one question which I think is good, and yeah, I struggle with this, taking notes from the chat actually, but interviewing remotely, are there any more pro tips on taking notes whilst maintaining engagement on screen?
Electronic is best. Mm-hmm. I would always tell them first, set it up right at the beginning and say that first, another good thing, and I'll come to, and it's a slight deviation because I've thought of it, is prepare them for if there is a technical glitch, what you're going to do about it. And then the second thing is, I will be taking notes, and the reason why, because we want to, capture your answers quite accurately. So I will be taking notes on the screen, and if there's a pause, please just, don't worry about it. The other thing is to record. You can record the interview.
Oh, I was just about to say that, sorry.
Yeah, it's just record, but then you've got to listen back to it. And I think capturing their exact words, if you can, really quickly. But Lewis, what do you do?
So I always warn the candidate that I'm not brilliant at typing and talking and listening all at the same time. So I say, bear with me, I'm just writing this down. So because people are terrified about gaps and they'll try and fill gaps, and you as an interviewer might feel the same. And if you actually say, I'm just going to pause for a second while I write this down, because I can't do both. And it just, again, you're building a rapport with them and you're being honest. And, it gives them a chance to have a break actually as well. Even if it's for 30 seconds, they appreciate it. It's just communication.
Yes.
If I just write it down, literally write it down into my template, I have a Word document with all my questions, when I can click into a field that is expecting my answers, and I just work my way through it as I'm talking to them.
I think one has to set it up and be very careful that they know it's being recorded, though.
If you're going to record it, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then what do you do with that information afterwards? So you've got to be aware of that.
Yeah, we don't do that, but I do take notes, obviously.
Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And Claire, I wondered if there was anything else in the chat, or if anyone wanted to ask some questions. We've got just a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, there was one about the informal interviewing. Did you want me to answer that, Claire?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
from Tom,
so again, it varies depending on what the roles are. So our agile team, so the Scrum Masters and product owners, what they like to do is to get a candidate or a potential candidate in for a coffee. Now, when I say potential candidate, I would say more than 70% of our Scrum Masters and product owners that we hire come from the community, from the meetups and so on. So they already know us. And they'll come in and have a coffee with a couple of the team. Now, the confidentiality is the same as any candidate. You know, the meetings are booked privately, so nobody else can, in the company can see. But obviously, they're going to walk into the building and out like anybody else. So you just treat them the same as a candidate. And even though it's not a formal interview, there's no such thing as an informal interview because you're going to get opinions. But it gives them a chance to just see if we're the right type of people. Now, the bias bit is a really key thing because we would then probably not include those people that had that coffee as part of the formal interview if they went further, because it's quite a big team and we've got other people we can invite in. And so we would have other interviewers doing the formal interviewing. And then at the end, if they did get offered and they got invited back, which they always will be invited back, and I think pretty much every Scrum Master and product owner I've hired has come back for that team chat. It's just their style. And in fact, I'd be worried if they didn't want to, because it's all about collaboration and communication for that role. And because those original people would be in that meeting. And, you know, you might end up with, 15 people taking this person to lunch, and they usually wander out the building or they get pizza in or something like that. So a long answer to your question, but I hope that helps.
Could be a bit daunting, 15 people.
Well, no, it's not, because they know 6 of them by
That's
then,
true, yeah.
and they know it's informal. They've already got the job at that point, so they've got nothing to be worried about. My worry is that they walk in and 2 people go, not happened yet, but this is one of the reasons they're coming in. Is there a personality clash? Better to know then than 3 weeks after they join, though.
Yes.
Excellent. Wow. Okay, great. At the moment, no, we haven't had any other questions that we haven't captured or discussed. So if there is anything after, what we will do is have a look through the Zoom chat anyway. So yeah, and we have recorded this session as well. We record all of our webinars and they're on a YouTube, our Cambridge Network YouTube channel. So all of those are accessible. So if anyone has missed Catherine's first in this series, it's on there. This one will be on there, and then our next one with you, Katherine, again on onboarding via video on the screen there, 6th of May from 11 till 12. So that's all available to sign up, and there are some spaces, but they are going quickly. So if you want to join us, then yeah, sign up quick. So thank you so much. Thanks to both of you. It's been really interesting. And thanks to everyone that came along for feeding us some fantastic questions. If anyone's got any other tips or anything that they want to share, then by all means get in touch with either myself, Claire, Angus at Cambridge Network, or my colleague Sarah, and we will share those with everyone.
Great. Thank you, Claire. And just to mention, and to Lewis as well, that there will be a resource available with all of the questions and the information that we've talked about today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Katherine. We'll send that around.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us.
No worries. Have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.